She is the most talked about, perhaps the most admired woman of the 20th century, and we always call her Jackie, as if we really knew her. But few agree on exactly who Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis really is, or what she means to our history. In this program, a Jackie you've never met before will help us answer those questions. I'm Peter Graves. This is Biography. Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis is a fascinating study in public life and personal style. For a time, she was like a princess to us, leading a charmed life full of elegance and sophistication. And yet some of the brutal events that she endured would eventually brand her life with the elements of Greek tragedy. Her remarkable story is one of the most compelling dramas of our time. In November of 1963, the world was stunned by the death of the American President John F. Kennedy. His assassination marked the beginning of a dark period in our history. But on this day, it was his young family, and especially his 34-year-old widow, Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy, who captured our hearts. A woman of extraordinary poise and fortitude, Jackie rose from the depths of this tragedy with a healing message of love.
I want to take this opportunity to express my appreciation for the hundreds of thousands of messages, nearly 800,000 in all, which my children and I have received over the past few weeks. The knowledge of the affection in which my husband was held by all of you has sustained me, and the warmth of these tributes is something I shall never forget. Whenever I can bear to, I read them. All his bright light gone from the world. All of you who have written to me know how much we all loved him, and that he returned that love in full measure.
Who was the little girl who grew up to become the most famous public figure in the world? With her beloved father, Jack Bouvier, Jackie enjoyed a privileged childhood, as did her sister Lee. Born in 1929, Jackie was a child of the Great Depression, but she never wanted for material things. Her family lived at fashionable addresses in town and on Long Island. Janet Lee, Jackie's mother, and Jack Bouvier would have marital problems, but while the girls were small, there was plenty to be grateful for. Jackie blossomed into a sensitive and strong-willed individual.
I am one of Jackie's first cousins. My mother was her father's sister. And we all used to get together in the summer in East Hampton, Long Island, at my grandfather's house, a place that was called La Sata. And he would hold about 2-month-long reunions of the entire family every summer. So we all stayed in the same house, and we all drew quite close at that time of the year. And I have many poignant memories of Jackie from that era. She was almost always dressed in riding costume, in boots and jodhpurs. And while her other cousins were down at the beach or playing tennis or running around in cars, she was, day after day, she would be in the riding ring. She was of an extraordinary young athlete. She wasn't the type that liked to pal around with all the young people, with all her other young cousins. She usually preferred to be off by herself, either up in her room reading poetry, or, as I say, endlessly working out those horses.
One of the poems Jackie composed at age 10 revealed an innocent love of the ocean. "Oh, to live by the sea is my only wish," she wrote. And in fact, swimming and sailing and walks along the beach would always be in Jackie's life. But the divorce of her parents dealt a painful blow to her innocence.
It was a very Catholic family, French Catholic family. And the divorce was a rather nasty one. because it developed that Jacques Bouvier was fooling around on his wife, and she got very upset about it. So it was a nasty divorce, and then her mother rather quickly found another man and married him, a man who was much, much wealthier than Jacques Bouvier. His name was Hugh Auchincloss, and he lived in a huge mansion up in Newport. So Jackie was uprooted from Long Island, where she had grown up, East Hampton, Long Island, and uprooted from New York, where she spent the winter, and went up to Newport, Rhode Island, to live with the Auchinclosses. And it must have been a difficult adjustment, because it was a very different kind of family. The Bouviers, coming from a southern French family, were rather temperamental and somewhat Mediterranean, let us say, in temperament. But the Auchinclosses were real old New England wasps.
In that conservative tradition, Jackie was sent off to exclusive girls' schools in the country. Then came prestigious Vassar College. There, and later at the Sorbonne in Paris, Jackie took her studies seriously. But it was her fresh beauty that put her in the spotlight as 1947's debutante of the year. In an era of narrowly defined social roles, the goal of most young women was supposed to be to catch a husband. And yet, not to be a housewife was the wish Jackie expressed in one of her school yearbooks. And so to the nation's capital and a job paying $42.50 a week. As the inquiring photographer for a Washington paper, it was Jackie who chased celebrities in the early days, including 2 future presidential rivals. No one can say who fell in love first, the bachelor congressman from Massachusetts with his Irish charm and athletic good looks, or the working girl with the inquisitive mind and unforgettable face. But Jackie did let us know where it all began.
I met him at the home of friends of ours who'd been shamelessly matchmaking for a year. And usually that doesn't work out, but this time it did, so I'm very grateful to them.
The ensuing 2-year courtship was between kindred spirits, but very different people. One a creature of politics, the other a lover of style and culture. At the Kennedy compound in Hyannisport, the courtship unfolded in an atmosphere of fun and games. The wedding of the year, as it was called, took place in Newport, Rhode Island on September 12, 1953. The reception afterward had the happy purpose and unforced joy of any wedding, and Joe and Rose Kennedy joined in the celebration. But this was no ordinary bride and groom, and no ordinary day. For Jackie, it was the start of a challenging new way of life. She was now part of her husband's large, competitive, and sometimes rambunctious family. Such was the fascination with their match that Jack and Jackie would be under constant scrutiny from now on. This would shape them both into figures larger than life on the American scene.
I was born in New York.
Your maiden name?
Jacqueline Bouvier.
Bouvier. French?
That's right.
Where did you go on your honeymoon?
We went to Acapulco, Mexico.
Do any fishing?
Yes, my husband caught a 10-foot sailfish, which he has in his office.
A real prize catch. Did you help him haul it in?
Well, not really, but I was in the boat. All I did was pour water on him.
You poured water on him?
Yeah.
You say him, you mean the fish?
Well, no,
The fish
my husband.
On your husband?
Because it was so hot in that boiling sun, and he had to fight the fish for about 3 hours. So I had to stay there pouring water on him.
Baby Caroline arrived in 1957 and was baptized as both parents looked on with profound appreciation. Earlier, Jackie had suffered a miscarriage and a stillbirth, so the christening of this healthy child had special meaning for the entire family. Caroline was a happy baby and brought the light of motherhood into Jackie's life. In nurturing her, Jackie discovered a hidden vocation. She had a genuine gift for child rearing. It relieved some of the burden in being the wife of an ambitious senator often away from home. Running for re-election, Jack Kennedy didn't hesitate to use his family to promote an attractive image for himself. But even in this TV campaign spot staged for the voters back home, it's obvious both Mom and Dad doted on their little girl.
Hey.
Pleasure to have you here, and I want you to meet my daughter Caroline and my wife Jackie.
How do you do? I'm glad you had a chance to see something of the Senate, and now to see our house where we've lived a year, and since Caroline was born. And I look forward to meeting all of you this fall as soon as the Senate is out, and we'll be back in Massachusetts.
Thank you very much for coming to see us, and we'll look forward to seeing you in very shortly. Say goodbye to Caroline.
The Kennedy clan's togetherness was its trademark, and it was Jackie's duty to fit in, especially when the matriarch of the family was host. Rose Kennedy was a deeply religious woman with an imperious style, who would grow to appreciate Jackie for her own remarkable qualities.
Sister Eunice, now Mrs. Sergeant Shriver.
Jack's sisters were happy just to play supporting roles. Some in-laws made fun of his young wife as merely a society girl, but Jackie had too much self-confidence to let that bother her, and she was prepared to field the right questions.
Right now, Mrs. Joseph P. Kennedy.
Won't you tell us, Jacqueline, a little about your experiences?
I've enjoyed campaigning so much, Mrs. Kennedy. Since September 15th, Jack and I have been traveling through the state trying to meet as many people as we can. Your youngest son, Teddy, who, as you know, is campaign manager, set up the schedule for us last summer, and now he joins us whenever he can get away from law school on weekends. We visited 184 communities, and I think slept in nearly every city in Massachusetts. And we must have shaken hands with nearly everyone in Massachusetts, too.
At home, Jackie's life centered on Caroline and thoughts of her father, who had recently died of cancer. Devoting herself to her baby girl was a source of consolation and joy in a difficult year. The sadness of the past soon dissolved as Jackie was swept into the future by a momentous political gamble.
I am today announcing my candidacy for the presidency of the United States. The presidency is the most powerful office in the free world. Through its leadership can come a more vital life for all of our people. In it are centered the hopes of the globe around us for freedom and a more secure life.
Jackie had no love for politics, and crowds made her nervous, but you wouldn't guess that watching her in action during the 1960 presidential campaign. Even in the pouring rain, Jackie had star quality, a factor not seen in American politics before. She made undecided voters sit up and take notice when she was at her husband's side. Fundraisers can be dull affairs, even with a charismatic after-dinner speaker. But when the candidate's wife was Jackie, an ordinary party function somehow became a night to remember.
Kennedy, 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 Kennedy,
On Election Day, the Kennedys arrived at the polling booth knowing only that a tight race was expected, maybe the closest in history. It was speculated Jackie's presence in the campaign might make the difference. By 3 a.m., there were hopeful signs for the Democratic ticket, but campaign manager Bobby remained thoughtful. Not until 9 in the morning could the Kennedys claim victory. It was Jackie who first invoked the legend of King Arthur to describe the Kennedy years in Washington. Unofficially, that reign of Camelot began here in a crowded armory with a statement that was part politics and part birth announcement.
The next 4 years are going to be difficult and challenging years for us all. So now my wife and I prepare for a new administration and for a new baby. Thank you.
Only 3 weeks later, the president-elect was drafted into service as a babysitter for Caroline. John Fitzgerald Kennedy, Jr. was born on November 25th, 1960. Coming home from the hospital, Jackie now had to turn her thoughts to questions like how to prepare a young family for life in the White House and what to wear at the inauguration. January 20th, 1961. With all the pomp and pageantry the Kennedys could muster, the swearing-in ceremonies got underway. Men strutted in tails while Jackie stood out from all in her signature pillbox hat and chic attire. Outgoing President Dwight D. Eisenhower, the much-respected Ike, was the standard-bearer for America at mid-century, while JFK stood for the future. Onlookers waited to hear what might define the new administration's break with the past, and they got it.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
And so the transition in executive power was completed. A parade took the youngest American president ever elected at age 42 through the streets of Washington with his beautiful 31-year-old wife at his side. The weather was freezing cold, but it seemed fitting for the Kennedys to be cruising through town in a convertible, symbolic of America's open, friendly, and trusting nature. Together on this historic day, Jack and Jackie looked more like glamorous film stars than heads of state. But for the immense crowds that had turned out, the couple struck a memorable profile in courage and youth and hope. When the Kennedys moved into the White House, the social calendar of the nation was rewritten. Jackie transformed the presidential home into democracy's palace, a glittering hall of culture and entertainment for the country to enjoy. Setting the standard for elegance was Jackie herself. Privately, she thought First Lady sounded like the name for a saddle horse. But on the White House receiving line, she was definitely first in finesse. Jackie single-handedly rescued the White House from decades of benign neglect. Antiques, furnishings, and art were installed following her own careful research. They restored the warmth and historical authenticity to the public rooms of the mansion. Jackie's soirees at the White House were the talk of the town and of the world. Spain's Pablo Casals was only one of the many cultural legends who answered her call to perform. For artists of the early 1960s, an invitation to play the White House was the ultimate stamp of approval, as coveted as an Oscar or a Pulitzer Prize. When Leonardo's famous Mona Lisa came for a visit, Jackie was there to welcome the portrait that some said mirrored the enigmatic beauty of the First Lady herself. But Jackie's admirers didn't find her a puzzle.
She brought a new fashion to the White House we had not seen, a style. And I think one of the things that she didn't get credit for, we tended to focus on the fashion and the style and the stuff, and I think that's because they want to sell more of that stuff to women. Cynical. What she really did, that she really ought to get credit for, is she made Americans stop and think about their history and realize if they didn't start preserving it, they were going to lose it.
Millions of visitors to Jackie's White House could now see the heritage she herself had long valued.
I remember the first time I came here as a child. I was 11 years old, and my mother brought me here on Easter vacation. When I think of all the school children who come through here, I think there should be flowers when there can be, and fires going, and the pictures, and to make it look rather like a home and not so frightening.
Her father taught her not to seem, in the company of a man, to seem too bright, too smart. to keep her brain somewhat hidden. And that may be an explanation of this kind of naive, wispy presence of hers, especially back in those days. It came out when she was guiding the public through the restored White House. And even Norman Mailer made fun of her in an article. And she would come upon a piece of furniture and in this sort of whispery voice, and you know that desk over there belonged to President Monroe. She almost looked kind of dumb, but she wasn't. She was putting on somewhat of an act there. She's very bright, she's very smart, and has a great deal of interior fortitude. But she can disarm people with this sort of whispery voice and sometimes a not very forceful presence.
When it came to her children's welfare, Jackie could be very forceful. Thanks to her, both Caroline and John led remarkably normal lives in the circus atmosphere of public life. Jackie protected the privacy of their formative years against all comers and all odds.
Jackie Onassis has to be one of the greatest mothers who ever lived. As far as I can see, those kids, Carolyn and John, are in great emotional shape. And the odds against this were enormous. Enormous. I don't know how she did it. I think she did... I think she did the civil equivalent of locking them up in the basement. That's a metaphor. Obviously insulated them from an environment in which they would either take themselves too seriously or in which they would be tempted to escape the terrible heat that had to accompany them as they grew up without their father. I admire her very much, very much.
I admire Mrs. Onassis immensely for the way that she has brought up her two children. There have been all kinds of difficulty with the Kennedy kids, and despite the fact that there have been stresses and strains upon the Kennedy children, all of them, Joe Kennedy's grandchildren, nonetheless, Mrs. Kennedy, it seems to me, has done a superb job of bringing up these youngsters.
If you bungle raising your children, I don't think whatever else you do well matters very much.
As mother, wife, hostess, and even ambassador, Jackie truly was an indispensable partner in the Kennedy mystique.
We identified with John Kennedy and Jacqueline Kennedy, not with their politics, but as a young couple, as a young family. And there was about them a sense of moving forward, a new spirit, and a sense of idealism with which we identified. Again, not in any partisan political way, that issue by issue we had differences with them. I'm not even sure my wife voted for John Kennedy. But they, for that what has been called brief shining moment, represented renewal of the American ideal. And we could look at the Kennedys and say to ourselves, that's the picture of America we want the world to see.
When Jackie joined her husband on trips abroad, her presence intrigued dignitaries and common folk alike. And when she spoke to them in their own words, she touched their feelings.
One of the Kennedys does not need an interpreter, so I'd like to have my wife say just a word to you.
Per el vivir recientemente y recibir enseñanza. Estas cosas deberían estar al alcance de todos y no limitarse a unos pocos afortunados.
Paris was the high point of Jackie's personal diplomacy as First Lady. French President Charles de Gaulle made it a point to welcome her in person, even though he was quarreling with the U.S. on state matters at the time. In Paris, often accused of giving strangers the cold shoulder, it was one thing to see officialdom turn out for the occasion, but the warmth and affection shown by Parisians for Jackie took even her husband by surprise.
I do not think it altogether inappropriate to introduce myself to this audience. I am the man who accompanied Jacqueline Kennedy to Paris, and I've enjoyed it.
It was fitting Jackie receive a royal welcome in France. Her Bouvier family were proud descendants from the French. She always looked to France for ideas and inspiration about art and fashion. And for their part, the French, and now the rest of the world, adored Jackie for her independent style.
I think she had class. I think she had a lot of pizzazz. I think she was, again, a woman who was much beset and set upon. I think that Jacqueline Kennedy had something Dorothy Dandridge and Marilyn Monroe did not have. And that is, she had the ability to invent herself. In other cases of very beautiful women, and/or very powerful women, save for Miss Eleanor Roosevelt, many of the women whose names became household words were invented by their social circumstances. They were invented. I think Mamie Eisenhower was invented by her marriage to Ike Eisenhower. I think Patricia Nixon was invented and allowed that invention to be the only face which was seen by the public invention of herself. I think that Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis had the pizzazz to step aside and invent herself. She was bodacious, and I admire that.
During their 3 years in the White House, Jackie managed to get her husband away from pressures, if only for a brief sail on board the presidential yacht. It was an opportunity for the nation's first family just to be themselves again, and that came naturally to all of them. Children grow up quickly, and it must have occurred to the Kennedys, as it does to all busy young parents, that time is precious. As a child of divorce, Jackie could appreciate family time and family values more than most. By now, Jackie seemed to have come to terms with her own marriage, and reports of infidelities the general public was unaware of at the time. She accepted her husband's absences with dignity, using the separations to pursue her own interests and those of the children. And there were always homecomings to look forward to. In this scene from August of 1963, before the president can greet Caroline and John, Bobby's kids rush by him to welcome their own dad. Jackie was carrying their third child at this time, but would lose the baby in a premature birth. For the couple, this was a devastating loss that brought them very close. Meanwhile, Caroline's progress on her pony was a source of undisguised pride for Mom. Jackie had loved horses from her own earliest years, and she would remain a passionate equestrian all her life. As for her skill in the saddle, she could jump with the best of them. It was easy for Jackie to immerse her children in the world of horses. These intimate scenes show the president himself relaxing on the family's rented Virginia farm and looking as if he didn't have a care in the world. It was the last weekend in the country the family would spend together. If Jackie could have shaped the future for her loved ones, perhaps this is what it would have looked like. Jackie hadn't planned to go to Dallas in November, but losing baby Patrick changed that. Husband and wife needed to be together. Against everyone's advice, she made the trip. A local family's home movie chanced to record the central event of that day, and history will not soon forget its last look at JFK.
It appears as though something has happened in the motorcade route. Something, I repeat, has happened in the motorcade route.
Just a moment, we have a bulletin coming in. We now switch you directly to Parkland Hospital.
President Kennedy has been assassinated. It's official now. The president is dead.
On the plane carrying Kennedy's body, Lyndon Johnson was sworn in as president as Jackie stood by in a blood-stained suit.
Reserve. Protect. Defend. Constitution of the United States.
These dramatic images were sent all over the world with the use of the new technology of international television. It was an official state ceremony, but we were all gripped by the loss of a family. In the midst of her grief, Jackie found the strength to oversee every significant detail of her husband's funeral. With Bobby and Teddy at her side, she chose to walk behind the coffin and riderless horse from the White House to the Capitol, from the Capitol to the Cathedral.
I was in the White House right after the burial of the president, where Jackie was receiving the heads of state of the world. She looked like the head of state at that point. She was greeting General Charles de Gaulle and Prince Philip of Edinburgh and Mikoyan of the Soviet Union. All the great prime ministers and heads of state of the world were coming to the White House to give her their condolences. Meanwhile, however, she had organized upstairs in the family quarters of the White House. See, all this was taking place down in the state rooms on the ground floor. She had organized a birthday party for little John, who had just turned 3 years old. The day of his father's burial, he had just turned 3. And there were all these kids with little party hats on and little, those little horns that you toot at birthdays. And John was just having the best time opening his presents, and everybody was coming up and saying happy birthday, and they were singing the birthday song. She did not let the momentous events of those days, the funeral procession, the burial out at Arlington was such a tragic thing. And she did not let that distract her, though, from her duty as a mother, which was to celebrate her son's birthday party.
Following the assassination, Jackie spent much of her time in seclusion. Then, after 5 tumultuous years in American history had passed, she reemerged in the public eye. Jackie traveled to Scorpios, the island home of Greek shipping millionaire Aristotle Onassis. There, on October 20th, 1968, she married Onassis, nearly 25 years her senior. The wedding of the president's widow provoked shock, surprise, and guesswork all over the world, and still does.
I was lecturing in the University of Indiana University, when somebody said, did you hear about Mrs. Kennedy marrying? And I was so much taken aback that I found myself saying, which Mrs. Kennedy? It was not a perfect union. But I think it served a purpose in giving her a sense of security that for some reason she didn't have.
The fact that this very attractive, very interesting woman would somehow veer off to marry Aristotle Onassis is, to me, I've never understood it. I don't understand it now.
Why Jackie married Onassis is an enigma which will probably never be solved. It was a great shock to all of us in the family and a great shock to practically everybody in the world. The thing that was so troubling to Jackie at the time was that she had grown very close to Robert Kennedy. Robert Kennedy had become sort of a surrogate father for her children. They were constantly on the phone. He was always giving her advice. She came to depend on him as a source of companionship and advice. And then that unimaginable thing happened, the second Kennedy assassination. Bobby was murdered in Los Angeles. And this absolutely undid Jackie. She was just unstrung by this. I really believe that she had to get away from all this violence, this madness that had broken out in American life. Murder of Martin Luther King, her husband, Bobby's murder. The whole scene had become a nightmare to her. And here Onassis had this ocean-going yacht, and he had this beautiful, serene island in the Aegean Sea, Scorpios. And she was dreaming of going there and just getting away from it all. And he was able to do that.
In that childhood verse of hers, Jackie had written, "Oh, to live by the sea is my only wish." Perhaps her only wish at age 39, after all she had been through, was emotional and financial security for herself and her children. Paparazzi coverage of the first years with Onassis portrayed Jackie leading a jet-set life on the Mediterranean. But she never stopped being the busy mother hen for Caroline and John. With the children in school, she began to spend most of each year back in New York, away from Ari. In spite of their globe-trotting get-togethers, the honeymoon between Ari and Jackie was soon over. Onassis himself suffered a tragic loss with the death of his only son in a plane crash. He became bitter and ill. Jackie's marriage to Ari cut her off from the Kennedy Trust Fund that had supported her. After Ari's death, his estate would leave her a settlement of $28 million. The end came for Onassis in March of 1975. At that time, Jackie issued a statement that began, "Aristotle Onassis rescued me at a moment when my life was engulfed in shadows. He meant a lot to me."
I think, though, that her image remains confused in most people's minds because, on the one hand, there is this image of beauty and dignity as First Lady, as the wife of President John F. Kennedy. And then there's the image of her and this funny old Greek guy, Onassis. It was a wholly different style of life for her. So that while the American people have had hold in their minds a very lasting impression of her, the impression remains enigmatic and confused. And I think very few Americans are able to reconcile in their brains and hearts their feelings about Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis.
She was a martyr, and she conducted herself with superb poise. She endured many humiliations, which she managed to transcend primarily by ignoring them. She has a perfect sense of her public availability. She gives out just enough of herself to keep from becoming invisible, but not so much as to become banal. So in that sense, she is strikingly successful architectural figure. I admire her.
Jackie will always mean different things to different people. She was called a prisoner of fame and yet overcame celebrity to achieve the goals she believed in. She worked to save New York's architectural heritage. She loyally came to Senator Ted Kennedy's aid when asked to. She built a career as a respected book editor, drawing on her lifelong love of literature and the arts. She cultivated enduring ties with her children as they grew and started their own careers and their own families. And yes, Jackie would become a grandmother. History has a right to ask, were the 1,000 Days of Camelot just an act? But Jackie never turned her back on the Kennedy legacy after all. As one admirer stated, when Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis enters a room, history walks in with her. We may think we fully understand this woman, but then we remember her life, and the romance and the tragedy and the controversy of it, and the fascination returns. There was no one like Jackie in our time.
It is my greatest wish that all of these letters be acknowledged. They will be, but it will take a long time to do so. But I know you will understand. Each and every message is to be treasured, not only for my children, but so that future generations will know how much our country and people in other nations thought of him. Your letters will be placed with his papers in the library to be erected in his memory along the Charles River in Boston, Massachusetts. I hope that in years to come, many of you and your children will be able to visit the Kennedy Library. It will be, we hope, not only a memorial to President Kennedy, but a living center of study of the times in which he lived, and a center for young people and for scholars from all over the world. May I thank you again on behalf of my children and of the President's family for the comfort that your letters have brought to us all. Thank you.
Few people have been as universally beloved as Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. Watching her over the years with her children and grandchildren, she came to be someone we all admired, someone we all cared about. So it was with great sadness that the world learned in February of 1994 that Jackie had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Despite intense radiation therapy, Jackie's decline was rapid. At her side throughout this time was her longtime companion, MAURICE. In mid-May, doctors told Jackie there was nothing more they could do. She asked to go home to her Fifth Avenue apartment. Family members and friends who rushed to be with her had to make their way through crowds of reporters and well-wishers gathered outside. Finally, on the morning of May 19th, John Jr. broke the sad news.
Last night at around 10:15, my mother passed on. She was surrounded by her friends and her family and her books and the people and the things that she loved, and she did it in her own way and on her own terms, and we all feel lucky for that. And now she's in God's hands.
Caroline and John Jr. arranged for their mother, who was just 5 months shy of her 65th birthday, to be laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery next to President John F. Kennedy.
God gave her very great gifts and imposed upon her great burdens. She bore them all with dignity and grace and uncommon common sense. May the flame she lit so long ago burn ever brighter here and always brighter in our hearts.
I often think of what she said about Jack in December after he died. They made him a legend when he would have preferred to be a man. Jackie would have preferred to be just herself, but the world insisted that she be a legend too.